Driving, 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 music's blaring in my ears. Engines roaring, 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 the horizon's drawing near. Pedal to the floor, no more feet.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Nonprofit Insider. My name is David Unger, and I'm pleased to be hosting a show with executive directors and key people of local nonprofits. I've worked in the nonprofit world for over 30 years, and in those years I've realized that the majority of the community does not know about the organizations that provide critical services we sometimes take for granted. The only time we hear from nonprofits a lot of the time is when they send us their annual appeal or an occasional newsletter. This is a chance to hear about the organizations that touch so many in our community. Before we get started, I do want to state that the opinions expressed on Nonprofit Insider are not necessarily those of WMPG, its staff and underwriters, or of USM. Today we have a really special guest with us. His name is Warren Whitney. Most of the people that know Warren call him Whit, and throughout the land trust community, he is known as Whit. Lan is the land trust program manager for the Maine Coast Heritage Trust. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, David.
So, let's start with the basic thing. What is a land trust?
Land trusts are nonprofit organizations who strive to conserve land through a couple different means, and then also work with their communities to have programming and events to get people out on those lands and enjoy those lands. They have legal tools, financial tools to acquire land, to conserve it. They're working with willing landowners, and they have a lot of volunteers. Volunteer board members, and sometimes staff. Some Maine land trusts in Maine are staffed, many are not. And they work in communities large and small. Some land trusts cover just a single town. Some land trusts work in a larger area, perhaps a watershed. And then there are a few of us in the land trust world that are statewide.
And you're one of the state ones.
Correct. Yeah, Maine Coast Heritage Trust is a statewide land trust, so we work in statewide, in this case, all up and down the coast. And our work inland is more through partnerships with other land trusts and other conservation organizations.
I've done a lot of work with land trusts around the country in various capacities in the last few years. And I guess the biggest dilemma that I'm picking up is the development, non-development, what's the good balance and ratio of developed land within a community? So how does Maine address this?
Well, it's an interesting question because most land trusts in Maine were founded in the 70s and especially in the 80s and 90s. And at that time, the concern was the rapid pace of development, and we're losing a lot of our special places. More recently, there's been also a concern about how can land trusts work with and helping a more vibrant community, including the economy of that community. So finding that balance between how much land should we conserve, where should we help improve the economy, and how do we do that is a really interesting question.
What do you see some of the objections of communities being with preserving properties?
Mm-hmm. The biggest one that you'll typically hear is the land coming off of the tax rolls, or that issue. Land trusts are private nonprofit organizations, and if a land trust purchases a property, which is one of the ways it can conserve it, if it purchases the property, then the land trust can, if it wants to, apply for property tax exemption. Now, some land trusts will apply for property tax exemption and then also make a payment in lieu of taxes, so kind of a contribution to the town. And that's in recognition that the town may be providing services, police, fire protection, that type of thing. Some land trusts feel that they are providing a service to the town, so they shouldn't be paying anything. And other land trusts feel that they should pay taxes using the state's open space or tree growth or farmland programs. So it depends on the land trust. They're not. They don't all do the same thing. Each land trust has its own board of directors that makes those decisions. But that property tax exemption question, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, where funding at the municipal level is increasingly tight, is an issue. And what land trusts have done and try to do is to educate people in the town and really get out the word about all the benefits they're providing. Programs that kids get kids from the schools out onto these lands, preserving open space, preserving water supplies, that type of thing. So the land trusts feel that they're providing all these benefits, and that deserves that property tax exemption. And some people in the towns are more concerned about just the tax base of the town
Right.
and that budget.
So basically, it's up to the individual land trust and the communities that they're working in to come up with a good compromise.
Exactly, too often some of the land trusts have focused and been working so hard on just trying to get that work done that they haven't done enough outreach to have people understand all that they're doing. So that's a constant challenge, is really making sure everyone realizes that all the benefits they're providing.
So as a statewide land trust, do you work with the individual land trusts in the state to give them guidance? Do you give them some operating principles to work under? Some of the principles actually come from the national level. The Land Trust Alliance has certain sets of principles. They call them the dreaded accreditation.
Well,
process?
and David's referring to accreditation, which is kind of a certification. But there's something called standards and practices, which, if you will, is kind of best management practices for land trusts, so that they're observing. They're not rules, but they're guidelines about how you should be operating, how you should be accepting land and working with donors and that type of thing. So we have my program, Land Trust Program at MCHT, does work with land trust and provide some consulting help, some financial help in other ways to get land trusts using some of these practices and help them develop those practices.
And this culminates next weekend, doesn't it?
Well, next weekend we have our annual Maine Land Conference, Land Conservation Conference. It is held on Friday and Saturday. A variety of longer workshops on Friday and a reception Friday evening, and then on Saturday is the main event at the Ararat Middle School in Topsom. It's an all-day event. We'll have about 450 people. We have 33 workshops and some awards and a plenary session, which this year includes a talk by Roger Milliken and Terry Tempest Williams, the author. So which many people have probably heard of her. So we're looking forward to that. It's kind of certainly a big event every year at the start of the spring season, just before land trust staff and volunteers are getting out on the lands and cleaning up the winter trails and other trails that have had blowdowns and that type of thing, and especially this winter, and getting ready for their summer season.
I've been to both the Land Trust Alliance rally and several state land trust conferences, and I have to admit the energy that I feel coming out of the Maine conference is just incredible. I mean, people are energized when they come out of these sessions.
It's a great session, and we have kind of renowned for having a great conference. And as you point out, a lot of energy. We have a lot of people who've been involved with this for a long time, and I think they get energized every year with that. It's known far and wide as one of the bigger and we like to think better conferences. But it's just a kind of a kickoff event, and people, after a long winter, they're glad to see each other. They're glad to start thinking about getting out. We build in a lot of networking time and time for coffee breaks and lunch and that type of thing, so people have a chance to catch up with old friends and get ready for the year ahead.
How many people are you expecting this year?
We'll have about 450, that's it's grown a little bit over the years, but it's right in that range. And they come from all over the state. We have also people from some of the surrounding New England states who like to do the circuit of some of the other conferences.
Right.
We have some people from Canada, New Brunswick. Some folks come down because they don't have quite the setup that we do, so they enjoy the education that they can get here. So we've had people a few years ago, someone from Oregon.
Wow.
From all over.
And how many land trusts will be at the conference? And then the second part is how many land trusts are in Maine itself?
Well, Maine has a total of 90 land trusts, kind of 92 land trusts is the exact number. Most of those will be there. There are some, very smaller land trusts that are really dependent on a handful of people, so they may or not show up. But certainly most of the land trusts will be there because it's a big event for the year.
What do you think the most significant problem facing land trusts today?
I would say I mean, there's always any nonprofit, as I'm sure you're doing the show. People are often talking about the finances, and especially after the 5 years. And so that's
No,
never
never a problem.
that nonprofit part of nonprofits is right. So that's obviously an issue. But I think a big issue for land trusts is the people in terms of how many people are active. A lot of land trusts started very small, very grassroots oriented. And so they have a small pool of people to draw upon. So they're always looking for more volunteers, more board members. And any organization like this, it really runs on the strength of the volunteers and the board. You can hire staff, but you've got to have that backbone, that foundation of a good board and good volunteers who are active. So that's as these land trusts were formed 20, 25, 30 years ago, they had a group of people who were very active and very interested. And so some of those land trusts have had trouble getting new people, whereas hopefully most of them are working and bringing in new people all the time. So that's just getting the people. So I just encourage listeners, if they are interested in a land trust or any nonprofit organization, to get involved because it's the people that make it work.
Oh, absolutely. And, the whole concept of volunteerism has evolved over the last decade or so. It used to be you volunteer for a good block of time, but now what we call project volunteers.
Right. This idea that you're not committed for 5 years, but maybe I'm committed for this weekend.
Right.
And that comes with the whole social media and how do you get out the word and all of that.
And I'm really impressed with the amount of projects, not only that the MCHT has, but land trusts throughout Maine that provide those kind of weekend opportunities.
Right. I think those events are they're twofold. They're one is to help the organization and getting people involved, and that obviously affects membership. But there's this more of a responsibility that I think these groups have is to get out the word and connect people to these lands, and especially youth. I think that's an emphasis that most land trusts have or are utilizing is getting youth involved. You've read the statistics about the connection, too much time on iPads and smartphones and computers and all that. I think I've heard one statistic that said something like, and I don't know how, where this comes from, but that most fifth graders, I think, spend something like 45 hours a week connected to an electronic device, but less than a half hour a week in unstructured outdoor play. Right. So travel team soccer, that doesn't count, but just goofing off outside is kind of a lost art. And how do we get people out there? How do we get these kids spending some time away from all these electronic devices and connecting them to that land again, having those experiences? Because these are obviously the people who will be conserving those lands and caring about those lands in the future. And if you don't have that connection, if you don't have that deep appreciation for some of these places, 20 years, 30 years down the road, when you're an adult who has either the power or the money or whatever it is that's going to help you conserve some other places, if you haven't had that connection, you won't do that.
Right. And when you talk about development and land trusts and preserving properties, once the property's gone, it's gone.
Right. They're not. What's the old saying? They're not growing any more land.
Right.
And once it's paved, once there's a house there, that's gone. So that's what we're about is just finding those special places, finding those places that are natural habitats that have high recreational values. Have high values for access to the water, both for recreation and commercial activities like clammers and things like that, and just scenic, iconic places as well. All those places, what are you doing about those? How are we going to conserve those? Which of those places are we going to care for?
So if I'm hearing correctly, and I may be off base, if we take the funding out of it, which is always an ongoing problem for every nonprofit, obtaining volunteers to help with your mission and your work is your primary concern at this point?
Yeah, and especially I would say board members, building a strong board. Like a lot of nonprofits, so often that activity, that work is done by a small number of people. So you may have a board of directors of 15 people, but it's 2 or 3 or 4 that are pulling, really pulling the weight of the organization.
Right.
So any organization tries to broaden that and make more people, get more people involved, and really spread the load. And that's when it works well. Is when there are more people involved who are taking part and are engaged and are interested.
Right. So I have to do a midpoint identifier now, but before we do that, I have a trivia question for you, and I want you to think about it hard.
It's not celebrity trivia, is it?
Oh, man, do I have to switch?
No, I wouldn't do well.
So I'm going to ask you a trivia question. I'll do the midpoint identifier, and then I'll come back and see if you know the answer.
Okay.
What was the first land trust in the United States? And, your whole employee review will be dependent.
And you want the answer now? Or
No, I have to do my
Okay.
identifier. This is WMPG, and I'm David Unger, and today we're talking to Warren Whitman, who is the Land Trust Program Manager of the Maine Coast Heritage Trust on Nonprofit Insider. And right before the break, I asked Whit the trivia question. What was the first land trust in the United States?
I don't know the year, but I think the answer is the Trustees of Reservations in Massachusetts.
You're absolutely right.
There we go.
And the year was 1891.
1891, long time ago.
Long time ago. They're an interesting group down there. I've had some interaction with them. They have a very strong network down there.
A very strong network all over the state, and they have some very large and very well-used preserves, beaches and other areas that a lot of the public really knows about and enjoys and uses a lot. So they're a very strong group.
What would you think the best kept secret is in Maine in terms of preserved properties?
The best kept secret in conserved properties, I would have to say some of these, and part of this, one of this is some properties that MCHT has, but it's also connected to near some state land, as the Bow Coast of Maine. So this is far down east, Washington County, right outside of Lubec. There is for instance, the state has a 10-mile trail on the Cutler Coast Unit, I think is the official name for it, and then there are other MCHT, and then Down East Coastal Conservancy, which is the local land trust there, has some walks and hikes and some landscapes that are just unlike anything you've seen. You show pictures of these areas to people in Maine, and they say that's not here, is it? It's not in the state. It's really huge cliffs and really dramatic coastal landscapes.
And it's all protected by a land trust somewhere.
Well, a land trust or the state owns some of this land as well. So yes.
So you do a lot of cooperative work with the state?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Probably the biggest way that a lot of land trusts worked with the state was something called the Land for Maine's Future program, or LMF, it's often known. So every few years, the voters will see a bond on the ballot question about setting aside some money that can be used for land purchases and conservation purposes. And it's a very popular program. Typically 60 to 70% of the voters are in favor. It's bipartisan. It's one of the least political things that happens in Augusta or around the state, because I think people in Maine have this deep connection for land. And those projects there's a state sponsor for the land trust, so there'll be an organization, the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, for example, that will work with land trusts and to put forth those proposals, and then the land trust will, or some other organization will own the land and conserve it and make it available to the public.
I was talking to an executive director of one of the smaller land trusts last week, and he was explaining to me that one of the difficulties he has is explaining to the community why it's important to preserve farmland. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Here we are spending money to preserve the farmland while the farmer's working it,
right,
and obtaining a profit on it. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, especially in the more rapidly growing areas, the value of the land keeps on going up compared to what that is often called the best use of that land, which is a kind of a questionable term, because the best use, as a property appraiser will often determine, is a subdivision. But so that aside, the land is highly valued. The taxes are higher. It's harder for people to buy that land if they wanted to farm it. It's harder for them to hold on to it, even with some of the tax programs that are available. And so what a land trust can do is, by conserving it, it takes away the potential for that to be subdivided in the future. So it reduces the value, but certainly not the value to the farmer. The value to the farmer is this is great land, I can farm it, and now I can hold on to that land at a price that I can afford. There are a lot of land trusts working in agricultural projects nowadays. The Maine Farmland Trust is a statewide land trust that focuses on agricultural lands, and then many land trusts, either in partnership or on their own, are doing farmland conservation.
I get excited about this. I mean, I'm working with some very, very small land trusts and some very large land trusts, and the issues are so all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
If you had to describe one program that would be your showcase program, what would it be?
One program for
The MCHT.
For Maine Coast Heritage Trust, a good showcase program. Well, we're doing a lot nowadays with what we're called community conservation. So we're looking at not just conserving these pieces of property, but how can we use that property to make a difference in people's lives and to make a difference in communities. The one that quickly comes to mind is our projects we have in Lubec, where we have sponsored the Lubec Outing Club, and our steward in that area, Melissa Lee, works with the local schools and gets them out on the land, gets these kids out on trips, and really getting to know some of the areas in that region. And it's surprising how today's youth often aren't getting out as much as they should, aren't getting out in these landscapes. They're part of their heritage. This is where they're growing up, and they don't know as much about it as they should. So we're getting these kids out there. So that's a great program we have.
It's exciting. I know a little bit about it, and it really is a good program. All right, here's the hard question. You ready?
Okay.
You have 15 seconds left before we get cut off. Why should someone contribute to the Maine Coast Heritage Trust?
Well, I'll turn that around to why should you contribute to your local land trust, and whether that's MCHT or a local land trust. And that's because
Very diplomatic.
I know, and that's because we're connecting people to land. We're conserving these properties so that they're available in the future, so they'll always be there for folks to take advantage of. And then there's programming that gets people out there and connects them.
But what's in it for me?
It's for you. You get to take advantage of those properties. You get to enjoy that property. It's good for your health. It's good for your mental health, your physical health. It's good for your kids, and just knowing that the kind of places you grew up in, they're there for your kids as well.
Okay. I need to drill that down a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, I have 15 seconds.
I know. But when you conserve a land,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you're not just conserving land, but you're conserving the habitat and the wildlife and everything involved with that land.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
You haven't talked about that at all.
Well, the habitat is critical, and a lot of land trusts will do focus areas, and it's not enough to, for example, just do a 3-acre piece of property. It's can we connect lands? Can we connect lands that will that conserve a certain habitat for certain species? Land trusts will work beginning with habitat maps and information that's available from the state, and prioritize those areas where there are certain rare species or certain environmental communities that work with each other, and ecosystems that depend on having a little larger block of land. So there's that kind of
Right.
habitat protection in focus areas. There are access areas, so all too often land that we used to take for granted. We used to think that we'll always be able to go there, we'll always be able to access the lake or the swimming hole or the ocean or whatever it is. And people assume that they can go there forever, and they can't. And all of a sudden there's a new owner, they don't like the people there, whatever, and they can't access those things. So that's what we do that as well.
Technology must be a major asset to you with all the documents that you have to do and the maps and everything else. So is it all all in the cloud, or is it still?
Well, I think like everyone, it's a little bit of everything, and like we're all transitioning, and just as soon as you went from paper to CDs, now it's in the cloud. So yeah, it's depending on the capabilities of the organization, how large they are, their expertise, but definitely moving there, using that both in record keeping, which is important because we're conserving land in perpetuity, but also in membership work and all of that, using social media, maps, GPS units, all important, and making it easier and easier to do a lot of this work.
There's a program that I've heard, and I probably shouldn't mention the name on air. It's called Storyteller, I believe, where it's a GPS map, and you go through the land trust, and it actually gives you audio
Okay.
of the points that you're at as you're driving through it. So.
Yep, there's a similar program. Some of the land trusts are now using QR codes, so they'll have a trail, and they'll have just a small sign next to an important feature with a QR code. Those if you have your smartphone and you're in a place where there's reception, which is sometimes an issue, and then it'll bring you to a website that shows you what's important about this.
So how can someone contact you if they want more information about your programs or to make a gift?
Sure. Again, my name's Warren Whitney, the Land Trust Program Manager at Maine Coast Heritage Trust. And my email is whitney@mcht.org. If you're interested in finding out who your local land trust is and where they are, I'd strongly recommend you go to www.mltn.org, as in Maine Land Trust Network. And there's a Find a Land Trust tab, and then you can search for a land trust by county or by name and find out who are the people, what's the organization like, go visit their website.
Great. Well, thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Next week, we have Susan Greenwood. Susan is the Executive Director of the Cromwell Center for Disabilities. The music from today's show is complimentary from Mike Hubbard. You can find information about Mike on www.michaelhubbard.com. And thanks to Deb Danger, NPI's Executive Engineer. Until next week, see you later.
Growing, I've grown too big for tourist towns. Yeah, I might leave a few friends behind, but these weights are tying me down. I can't be sure that there's something in store that will quench my furious appetite. I'm a